Hi, welcome back to Risk Management. Today's topic is Risk Communication Part 2. We're dealing in the subject of affect. Remember, this is the unconscious, intuitive, automatic way in which humans think in a valenced sense to try to come up with the qualities of whether they like or dislike something. Of course, when we're dealing with risks, it's always something we dislike, something that we think is painful or something to be avoided or something that is negative. And therefore, we're dealing with a fearful reality and we're dealing with perceptions. Because ultimately, it's perception that drives whether or not we believe something is a risk. And that risk assessment science, if you will, fits within a culture of law, culture, media, politics, power, emotion, reason, and psychology, all of which contribute to our understanding of whether we are communicating effectively or ineffectively about risk. And so ultimately, today's topic is trying to ask the question, how, given that all people have affect, can we effectively communicate about risk to try to capture the true essence of what a risk is or is not, given that affect is imprecise, emotional, and not subject to persuasion and reason the way that cognitive reasoning is. So, let's get started, and I'm going to give you a couple of slides just discussing some background in how we understand affect. And then we're going to move on to some studies about how risk perceptions and risk communication take into account the fact that all people have affect. So there was an interesting study done by a guy named Robert Zions at Stanford University. He's a psychologist there back in 1980. This is a classic study done in which he took a Chinese or Japanese ideograph. You'll see it in the middle of your screen here, some sort of neutral symbol that shouldn't necessarily have a particular affinity that we attach to it. It's not like we like it or dislike it. It's something that most people who are non-Asian speakers would be able to understand as just being some sort of Asian ideograph. So he would present one of these on the screen, and then he would ask people, after showing that picture for 2 seconds, to rate their affinity or liking of that picture on a scale of 1 to 6, 6 being the highest, 1 being didn't like it at all. Now it seems a little strange because you say, well, how do I rate something that sort of seems neutral to me? But he asked them to do this experiment nonetheless, and he gave them 8 seconds in which to rate their liking of it. Now here's what he did that was interesting. Unknown to the participants in this study was the fact that Zions had a small subliminal image that came up on the screen for 4 milliseconds prior to displaying the ideograph for 2 seconds. 4 milliseconds is too small a time period for you to actually cognitively recognize in your consciousness there's something on the screen. But your brain still does recognize it, see it, and record it. And what he did was he either flashed up a neutral polygon, like a triangle or a square or something like that, for control subjects, or in other circumstances, for some of the people in the study, he would put up a smiling face of a human or a frowning face of a human. So he has a nice controlled study set up where there's positive affect, a smile, negative affect, a frown, and neutral affect, just a polygon that's sort of shaped like a face. And so by flashing these up, his conjecture was that people who saw the smile would like the ideograph more than people who saw the frown. And indeed, that's what he found. Now that's a little bit bizarre because what it suggests is you can be conditioned to liking something based on something else that happens just seconds before it that you're not even aware occurred. So he can, in fact, merely through an exposure to a smile or frown, influence your likings or dislikings for something that otherwise should probably be neutral and that are seemingly unrelated to that priming experience. Now that's important to understand when we're thinking about the context of affect, because what Zions is showing us is that if in fact you have a prime that has affect to it, we can influence things totally unrelated to also have affect. And that means that it's almost like a contagion. Affect can breed more affect. We can create risks out of things that were not considered risks simply through this relatedness and association of seemingly random circumstances. So affect has a scale, as we've talked about before. At a far end, we have stigma or hatred for something. And at the other far end, we have bliss or extreme happiness or affinity for something, right? And then in between, we have the affect is kind of indifferent. I always use the example of paper or plastic bags in the checkout line. Which do you prefer? I don't care. I don't really have strong affect one way or another towards paper or plastic. I always get stuck on that question. Bliss, I'm going to a beautiful Hawaiian tropical vacation in the middle of wintertime. Oh, that sounds wonderful. I have good affective feelings about that. Stigma, a nuclear blast or something else that would be horrific, that we can put stigma and attach a huge risk to. So affect and risk, we need to talk about how these two are combined and how affect matters when we're talking about risk and trying to communicate about risks. Remember, there's two different ways that we approach risk. The way we've approached risk in most of this class has been cognitive, analytical, and deliberative, trying to use the best knowledge from science to understand what risks are and are not. Now, a lot of the times in this class, I'm sure you were fighting your intuitions about risk when we talked about it in an analytic and deliberative sense, the scientific sense, because your experiences or your feelings didn't line up with what the course was teaching. And in fact, that's probably very good that that's happening. It says you have affect, you have feelings and experience, and you have subconscious processes going on in your brain such that your intuitions do not always line up with the scientific reality. And so we can talk about risk as analysis or risk as feelings. And it turns out risk communication has a lot to do with risk as feelings. Here's a great little cartoon by Gary Trudeau, who does The Far Side. I love his cartoons. And here he has two gentlemen walking down the street, one African American on the right, one older white man on the left. And they're walking down the street, and they each say good evening, but they each have in their minds sort of a risk calculus. They're going through and checking off factors of whether this is a person who's safe or not to walk by in the middle of the street. So the older white man says he's black. He doesn't look aggressive. He's wearing loafers. That means he's probably not aggressive. He has his hat on backwards. That might indicate he's aggressive. So he's creating a checklist and goes through this and checks off the safety factors and the risk factors for this individual. Likewise, the African American goes through and he creates his own risk factors and mitigating factors in his mind about whether this person is a threat or not. Of course, nobody makes up lists like this in their minds. This would be the analytical, scientific way of doing it. But your subconscious is processing all the information it sees, hears, and feels whenever it is encountering its environment to determine whether there's risk or not. And so our subconscious affect is in fact creating checklists like this for us and in a sense processing all of it in milliseconds so that we can come up with a conclusion of whether to run, fight, or be neutral. And so these two individuals, obviously, in their subconscious checklists, end up greeting each other and walking by uneventfully. So he calls this street calculus. But the very point being that we do have these sort of subconscious checklists going on all the time. We just don't know about them. When affect is not strong, we can actually talk about risk in very scientific, conscious, reasonable ways. But when affect gets strong, such as with a nuclear blast or radiation, as you'll see in a future lecture, we lose all perspective about how to handle risk and whether or not that risk is truly a threat to us or not. And so ultimately what we want to do in risk communication, if we're really trying to do this well, is to try to take some of the affect out of it if we're trying to convey the scientific understandings about that risk, because affect biases us against the risk. Of course, if something really is risky, then we might want to leave the affect in so that people do things about it, that they react to the risk as they should. If it's a nuclear blast that's going to go off in their city, stigma attached to that potential is not necessarily a bad thing. We just don't want to overhype the potential to create unnecessary fears and adverse conditions and adverse actions as a result of misperceived or skewed risk perceptions. So I want to talk about a number of ways, and this is going to be a longer lecture today than usual because of this, but it's still important to try to congeal it all in one lecture. And so I want to talk about how your affect affects your intuitions about probability and risk. Okay? So there's about 5 different ways that affect has been studied to influence your intuitions about probability. And remember how important probability is ultimately at the end of the day when we're studying causation and we're trying to establish whether something's a risk or not. Probabilistically, we want to know how likely is this risk also. And so what we'll see is that affect really skews our perceptions both of the risk and of its likelihood. So influence number one is the individual versus the group concern that comes up. And this possibility versus probability discussion actually came about from two gentlemen named Tversky and Kahneman in the 1970s. Kahneman won the Nobel Prize for related work based on something called prospect theory. Here is Mother Teresa saying effectively the same thing as they did, but in very simple words. If I look at the mass, I will never act. If I look at one person, I will. So this is an intuition that Mother Teresa had, which was when you're trying to create action or decisions in your mind, oftentimes if we have large numbers, we get swamped and inundated by that and we don't know what to do. Whereas if we look at just one individual, we'll know what to do. So this is also said by many other mystics and saints and poets and scientists throughout history. Here's Albert Georgi writing, who says basically the same thing as Kahneman and Mother Teresa. He says, I'm deeply moved if I see one man suffering and I'd risk my life for him. Then I talk impersonally about the possible pulverization of our big cities with 100 million dead. I'm unable to multiply one man's suffering by 100 million. So the insensitivity to genocide, to mass warfare, to huge cataclysmic events of man is not necessarily because we're brute, inhuman people, but because we simply cannot relate to suffering on that scale. We relate to it on an individual level. And so therefore, individual stories are very powerful to us, whereas group statistics don't tend to move us as much. Here's another person capturing that same concept. Annie Dillard says, there are 198,500,000 people alive in China. To get a feel for what this means, notice the emphasis on feel and meaning, those affective terms. Simply take yourself in all your singularity, your importance, your complexity, and your love, and multiply it by 1,198,500,000. See? Nothing to it. Of course, it does not happen that easily, does it? We don't really know how to multiply ourselves by 2 billion or a billion and come up with some greater understanding of risk as a result of that. And so we simply lack a vocabulary and a sense of feelings to describe and to think about and to react to large-scale losses of life. We use words like havoc, disaster, holocaust, catastrophe, tragedy, calamity, genocide. These are words we use to try to describe cataclysmic, horrible, wide-scale risks that have come true. But when we use the word tragedy, tragedy can be used when one person dies and we say, gee, it's a tragedy that they died at such a young age. It can also be used to refer to 100 million people dying. Hershey described Hiroshima as a havoc, a tragedy, a disaster. But Anne Frank's story of her family's survival and ultimately demise during the Holocaust was a story that can move us in a way that the statistic of 6 million dead Jews cannot. So we need stories, we need narratives, we need individuals for our affect to be triggered, for us to perceive and understand risk. And the media gets this oftentimes. The death of one child, they say, can be big news, but the death of 1 million children is rarely news at all. Every day around the world, about 35,000 young children die, not by being kidnapped, not by being beaten or raped or murdered, but because of a different kind of bondage, poverty. Children are dying due to our lack of attention and attention due to our attention and the government's attention. They die not because they have to, but because saving their lives is not a priority. In other words, most children who are dying every day are dying of malnutrition or lack of clean access to water or medical care. These are preventable deaths, but it's not something that's easily attacked or done with, something is done with it, simply because children who are dying from malnutrition don't have the meaning that a child, when we tell a story of one who was raped or murdered or something like that, we feel more for that child who is abused than we do for the children with malnutrition. Not saying that those lives don't matter, not saying that that's not the number one cause. The fact is, though, we're not addressing it the way we should, because statistics of 35,000 dead every day because of malnutrition simply don't register with us the way a very graphic story in the media does, such as the JonBenet Ramsey case back in the 90s of the perfect little girl in the perfect town of Boulder, Colorado, where there were never murders occurring, suddenly, shockingly being murdered, and how much news that generates versus the 35,000 nameless ones who die every day in a different type of tragedy. So the media sometimes does a good job and tries to create hero stories and things like this, where they'll put up a big story about water is so basic that everyone takes it for granted, and they talk about the pumps that saved Rwandan society. So these are great stories that talk about things where we can reduce risks that are basic to human existence, such as water supply and access to food. But these stories are few and far between, and it's hard to motivate people by such stories. Kahneman and Tversky understood this. They created this graph. It was part of their theory called prospect theory back in the 1970s. And what they said was this curve is nonlinear. That is, if you look at the slope of this curve, it curves off in both directions, both positively and negatively from subjective values based on gain or loss of lives or benefits or whatever it is we're measuring. And so the more lives that we are saving or losing, the less sensitivity we have affectively to the situation. If we can save just one life, people will react very heavily to that. But if it's 10 lives, we don't react as heavily as just one. And if it's 1,000,000 lives, we don't react as heavily for that incremental increase from 1,000,000, say from 100,000. So we always are improving, and there's always an increase in our response, but it's marginal past the first few. We really are a tribe of 150 people. We know how to react to losses within a small group, but when we get to large scales, humans are just not built to handle the masses of millions and billions of individuals' lives at risk. We don't think that way, and it's hard for us to wrap our heads around it and act in a way that is cogent and logical according to risk. So the second way, after we've talked about focusing on the individual rather than the group when it comes to discussing risks, is that we have imagery and anecdote. And those mean much more to us, it turns out, than simply telling the cold, hard statistical facts. If I show you a picture of a cute little calf, and I say, what a beautiful little animal, and look at this gorgeous farmer family that was caring for this calf, and I say, don't eat veal, you might, after this picture, very much be concerned about eating veal. Look at this beautiful little calf whose life you saved. And we might even give you credit for ends to animal killings by putting a picture like this in the newspaper, because after all, the picture of the beautiful little calf whose life I spared means a lot more to me than if I simply told you X number of calves suffer unnecessarily horrible demises at an early age because of inhumane animal treatment. If I put a documentary on, and this is one reason documentaries are so popular these days, is that animal killings are shown in the big screen. Watch the movie Food Inc., which gives you a very depressing view of the food industry. It does so through its graphic imagery, not because of its descriptions or because of the numbers it's giving. People understand this when we're talking about risk. Here's a picture of a demonstration that was put out in front of the US Capitol during the Iraq War called Eyes Wide Open. And rather than listing the number of statistical dead each day from soldiers fighting the war in Iraq, this group decided to go out and put empty soldiers' boots on the lawn in the front of the Capitol building. What a graphic image that portrays to us. Much more so than simply even this, where we say, here's what 5,000 looks like. This was also an attempt to try to portray how many were dying each day in the war in Iraq. But this, even though it does have some imagery and value to us, is not as powerful as an image like this with the seat of power behind it and all of these missing lives in front of it. We can even do this reducing it to one image and one person. Look at this. This is a very famous image from National Geographic from the 1980s when the Soviet Union had invaded Afghanistan. And this was entitled Along Afghanistan's War-Torn Frontier. Here's a young woman, and look at those tortured eyes. And we see in her eyes the suffering of war and the pain of loss in a way that no story and no statistics ever could tell. We see risk and we see fear up close and personal in her eyes. And this story really resonated, and this was the picture of the year in 1985 because of the image of her eyes and what they reflected in terms of the impacts and the risks of the war. So imagery and telling imagery about single individuals like this really can capture risk in a much more potent way than, say, the statistics that we generate as we've done through much of this class. Influence number 3 deals with proportionality versus absolute numbers. So there's a difference in the way we can project probabilities about risk. One way is through proportionality and the other is through absolute numbers, and you'll see the difference now. I want you to take out a piece of paper and try this exercise with me. If you haven't got it, stop the tape for a moment, go grab a piece of paper. It's a quick thing to jot down here, a number I want you to jot down, and then we'll do it again. Okay, now you've got the piece of paper. Here's the scenario put to us by a man named Paul Slovic, very famous risk communication psychologist. Slovic gives us the following scenario. Imagine you're a member of the Emergency Response Committee at O'Hare Airport. There is a proposal before your committee to purchase some expensive new equipment to use in the event of a crash landing of an airliner. The circumstances that might require such equipment to be used are rare but important. It is estimated that over a 10-year period, there's about 1 chance in 1,000 that equipment would be needed one time and that it would save 150 lives that would be in jeopardy in such an event. Thus, the benefit of the equipment in saving lives could be portrayed in the following gamble: 1 chance in 1,000 to save the 150 lives in jeopardy. Critics argue that the money spent on the system could be better spent enhancing other aspects of airport safety. So here's what I want you to do. You've been given this scenario. You have 1 chance in 1,000 to save the 150 lives in jeopardy as a result of instituting this safety mechanism. However, that money could also be spent elsewhere. How strongly would you support this proposed measure to purchase the new equipment? I want you to rate this on a scale of 0 to 20. 20 means you absolutely support this under any circumstances. 0 means you would not support this at all. 10 means you have moderate support. Write down a number now. Don't think about it too long. What your answer would be. Okay, got that? Good. I'm going to give you a new scenario now. I want you to write this on a new slip of paper. Imagine you are a member of the Emergency Response Committee at the O'Hare Airport. There is a proposal before your committee to purchase some expensive new equipment to use in the event of a crash landing of an airliner. The circumstances that might require such equipment to be used are rare but important. It is estimated that over a 10-year period, there's about 1 chance in 1,000 the equipment would be needed one time, and it would save 98% of the 150 lives that would be in jeopardy in such an event. Thus, the benefit of the equipment in saving lives can be portrayed by the following gamble: 1 chance in 1,000 to save 98% of the 150 lives in jeopardy. Critics argue the money spent on the system could be better spent enhancing other aspects of airport safety. Now, I want you to rate this scenario. How strongly would you support this proposed measure? 1 chance in 1,000 to save 98% of the 150 lives in jeopardy. Rate this on a scale of 0 to 20 again, 20 meaning you absolutely support it, 0 meaning not at all, and 10 moderate support. Okay, have you got your two scenarios? Scenario 1, you have a number for it. Scenario 2, you have a number for it. Now, here's what's interesting. I want you to look at your numbers. And my guess is for some of you, maybe not all, but when I've run this study in classes before, I get consistent results similar to what Paul Slovic got in his study, which is that more of you probably have a higher number for the second scenario than the first in terms of how much you support the outcome of the possibility of instituting the safety device. But here's the trick. The first scenario asked you what was your chance of it gave you a 1 in 1,000 chance to save 150 lives. So you had a probability of some benefit, 150 saved. The second one had the same risk probability as the first, 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 1,000. So in the second scenario, we also only have a 1 in 1,000 chance. But here, we're going to save 98% of 150 lives. 98% of 150 lives is not the same as 150 lives. In fact, it's 147. It's fewer. And yet most of you, or at least a large number of you, I would suspect, probably intuitively picked scenario 2 as one you liked more than scenario 1. That's at least what Paul Slovic found. He found that when you say, let's save 150 lives, that the mean support for it was 10.4. But that when you say save 98% of 150 lives, support jumps to 13.6. He also did this study where he actually reduced the percentage a little bit. He got, for 95% of the lives saved, 12.9 is the affinity, 90% of the lives saves, 11.7, 85% of the lives, 10.9. What's interesting is that any fraction, all the way down to 85% of the lives saved, actually people liked more, and you can see this in the bar graph at the bottom, than they did absolutely saving all lives. The point is, if I had said you can save 100% of the 150 lives at risk, of course you might have picked 150. But because I didn't give you a percentage, you were actually less inclined to pick the best scenario that saved the most lives because there was no percentage attached to it. So percentage means more to people's affect than absolute numbers. If I can give you a proportion of lives saved, that will carry more affective meaning, meaning you're more likely to react to the risk in an appropriate way than the number of lives saved. For example, in separate evaluations, there will be more support for saving 80% of lives at risk than saving 20% of 80% of 100 lives at risk than saving 20% of 1,000 lives at risk. So notice that. If I say I'm going to save 80% of 100 lives, usually there's more support for that, that's only 80 lives, than if I were to tell you you can save 20% of 1,000 lives at risk, which would be 200 lives. In that scenario, of course, we're saving more lives, but because the percentage is lower, we're inclined to favor scenario one. Advertisers get this all the time. In the news media or in the advertisements, save 33%. They don't tell you you're going to save $5. They tell you the percentage, because percentages create more affect and more likelihood to react than otherwise. Okay, so that's scenario three. So far, we've seen talking about individuals matters more than talking about groups. Talking in imagery or stories matters more than cold statistics, and using percentages over absolute numbers helps us better. Look at number 4, frequencies versus percentages. Look at these two scenarios, a 1% chance or 1 out of 100. Do these communicate the same or the different thing to you? Now, I don't want you to look at the logical thing, just your gut instinct. If I say you have a 1% chance of dying versus you have a 1 in 100 chance of dying, do you have a different feeling one way or the other about those statistics? You should, because it turns out that your affect does give you a different feeling about those. Look at the following scenario, again brought to us by Slovic in a study. He gives the following scenario. A patient, Mr. James Jones, has been evaluated for discharge from an acute civil mental health facility where he's been treated for the past several weeks. A psychologist has done a state-of-the-art assessment of Mr. Jones. Which of the following statements is more likely to cause professional psychologists to recommend Mr. Jones not be released? Number 1, patients similar to Mr. Jones are estimated to have a 20% probability of committing an act of violence to others during the first several months after discharge. Or, number 2, out of every 100 patients similar to Mr. Jones, 20 are estimated to commit an act of violence to others during the first several months after discharge. So, the only thing that changes between the way that we present these two scenarios to a group of people in Slovic's study is based on whether they're given a percentage probability of risk or a frequency percentage, 20 out of 100. And so he gave these two scenarios, and what's interesting is that when you give the probability versus you give the 20 out of every 100, more people are inclined not to discharge with the frequency than with the percentage. So the percentage actually gives us less of a feeling of risk and less negative affect than if we say 20 out of every 100 patients, in which case people perceive more risk. This has been picked up in other studies from people. Here's Yamagishi in a 97 study says that he did the following, and he looked at people and he asked them the following question. Rate a disease that kills 1,286 people out of every 10,000. Is that more dangerous than one that kills 24.14% of the population? Most people said yes, although if you do the math, the 24.14% of the population dying, if you took it out of 10,000 people, would be about double the number of deaths as it would be with 1,286 people. So the fact of the matter is that putting numbers in frequencies rather than percentages exaggerates the risk and makes it seem more drastic and more ominous than it actually is. Finally, influence number 5, imaging the numerator. Slovic does another study on this where he looked at the patient evaluations, that scenario we just saw of the mental patient, and letting them out of the hospital. And what he said is, what if there's a 10% chance of their leaving the hospital for some people? Then he asked other people, what if there's a 10 out of 100%, a 10 out of 100 chance the person would commit the crime if they were let out of the hospital? And then he asked other people, what if there's a 1 out of 10 chance that the person would commit the crime if they left the hospital? So notice, one is a percentage, one is a larger numerator and larger denominator, but the numerator is larger in the frequency, 10 out of 100 versus 1 out of 10. And what he found was that when you put this to people as a percentage, people typically will say, oh, that's a very low percentage. Very few people are violent, probably won't hurt anybody. It's probably safe to let them out. The affect of risk is not triggered in that small percentage form. When I put it out of 10 out of 100, and I say 10 out of 100 people like Mr. Jones could commit this crime, then people get a visual of 100 people, and they also get a visual of 10 people who are committing crimes. Mr. Jones is committing an act of violence, they'll say. And they'll say people are being harmed by the 10 out of 100, so there's some affect being triggered. But if I say 1 out of 10 people, like Mr. Jones, are going to be killing people, the image becomes about that singular individual and their potential. And so people then really have their affect and fear triggered, and they say, he could be that 1 out of 10. Some guy's going crazy and killing people, people would remark. The patient's going to attack somebody. This is an act of violence. There has to be at least one. Mr. Jones could be that one. So you can see how these are exactly the same three scenarios from a cognitive, rational systems type of logic. 10%, 10 out of 100, 1 out of 10, it's all the same. But for your affect, it's not. If I really want to get you stirred up, I'll say 1 out of 10 because the image and the focus is on that one, that narrative about that individual in the numerator. If I sort of want to stir you up, but not too badly, I say 10 out of 100. If I want to keep you calm, I say 10%. The same sort of thing can happen with imaging the numerator. Here's another example of reaching into a jelly bean jar to draw out jelly beans. Let's say you have two jars and think really quickly which one you want to draw out of. There's one jar, 7 out of 100 jelly beans are red, and one jar has 1 out of 10 jelly beans are red. Quick, which jar do you want to draw from to get a red jelly bean? Many of you will instantly say 7 because 7 sounds larger, and so there's an intuition because we're focused on, oh, 7, we'll pick from that jar. Most people pick from that first jar even after they're being told the frequencies. That is that there's a better likelihood of getting the 1 out of 10 in jar 2 than 1 out of the 100 from a jar that only has 7 jelly beans in it. One has a 7% chance, one has a 10% chance. Image, however, is king when it comes to risk perception. And so people oftentimes misperceive their risks, their odds, their likelihoods, simply because of that numerator focus. Somebody once said that statistics are human beings with the tears dried off. So affect puts the tears back on. And how do we do this? Well, the 5 things we've just talked about in this class today are ways that risk communicators have studied scientifically how we can use and channel affect to try to bring people to intuitive understandings of true risks. Notice, in doing this and what I'm teaching you now, there's an ethical obligation on the part of the risk communicator not to falsely perceive or falsely skew risks. It's our obligation when we are risk communicators to truly understand the scientific or financial risk first, and only then to communicate true risks and not false ones. Because if we communicate false risks and manipulate people's affect to do so, we're nothing more than fearmongers and unethical at that. So one way we can emphasize risk is to emphasize individuals over groups. Tell stories, tell images about singular people. That creates more interest in it. Affect-laden images, images that really capture the imagination, such as that girl and her tear-filled, fear-filled eyes in Afghanistan. Those really capture the psyche. Use proportions, not absolute numbers. If you're talking about proportions, indicate relative frequencies and don't use percentages, because percentages don't trigger our affect as much as does a relative frequency. And also make sure to emphasize the numerator, the number of bad outcomes, not the denominators, the number of total outcomes. When you put all of these together, you can create a very powerful, fear-based, sensitive effect that really will trigger people to pay attention to a certain risk. Risk communicators know this, the media knows this, advertisers know this, and they use these, if you want to call them tricks, to get people to pay attention. Your obligation as a risk communicator is to do so in an ethical way. Of course, if you run this in reverse, you can de-emphasize risk. And so one of the final things to say is that if we discuss any contradicting positive effect, you will offset that affect. So don't say, well, there's a 1 in 10 possibility that a nuclear bomb blast is going to go off, and show a picture of a nuclear bomb and say, however, one of the nice things we're doing in town today is we're taking everybody out on family picnic day, and you show pictures of families on picnics. That will offset the fear that people have that goes with that risk. So if you are trying to communicate a risk in very extreme terms, you don't want to have positive affect married to that risk discussion, because otherwise the risk won't be taken seriously, because the affect isn't keyed in and triggered in order to motivate people to pay attention to that risk. So we emphasize individuals, we use affect-laden images, we use proportions, not absolute numbers. If we're talking about proportions, we indicate relative frequencies, not percentages. We emphasize the numerators, and we don't discuss any contradicting positive affect. If you want to downplay a risk instead of upplaying the risk, run this in reverse. Emphasize groups, not individuals. Don't use imagery. Use absolute numbers, not proportions. Use percentages, not relative frequencies. And emphasize denominators, not numerators, and you will downplay the risk. So this is like a symphony with playing the emotions of individuals to get them to sensitively respond to risk communication. Again, I'm going to emphasize at the end of this lecture, ethics are important here because you're playing on people's emotions and sensitivities, and so you have an ethical obligation to communicate risk as effectively and as truthfully as possible. Okay, we're done for the day. And I'll look forward to hearing from you on the chat boards and your thoughts about how affect and risk go together. And we'll see you in the next class.